Summer 1941. A legend plunged into the searing heat of a final battle.
He's probably what we would now call an adrenaline junkie.
He'd flown 100 combat missions in just 16 months.
He was such a magnificent pilot.
Notching up 20 kills.
I couldn't do that with the legs that God gave me, and he could do it with tin legs.
Douglas Bader seemed invincible until a fateful search-and-destroy mission over occupied France. This is the compelling story of how a man with no legs conquered extraordinary odds to become Britain's most celebrated air ace.
Douglas Bader has an early childhood ambition to go to RAF Cranwell, which is the training college. He's an exceptional athlete, and in the corridors, they've got all the team photos of the squash teams, the tennis teams, the rugby teams, and he's a star pupil there. He comes second in his group when he passes out in 1931. He's a very bright individual as well. He's a clever man, but he also shows exceptional flying skill.
Trauma to the right knee, left leg broken in 2 places. Please keep calm, Mr. Bader.
Can you tell me to calm down? I've blown myself to bits!
It seemed that a high-flying life of achievement and sporting excellence was over for Douglas Bader. It was 1931. An aerobatic maneuver ended in a horrific accident that changed the impulsive 21-year-old pilot's life.
Doing acrobatics is very, very difficult. It's very, very highly skilled. Turns, barrel rolls, dancing around the sky. That's the point of being a pilot, because a biplane is all about maneuverability. It's not about speed. And at this, Bader is absolutely one of the very best, most highly skilled pilots in the country. The accident comes in December 1931. And he's performing a move that he's done many, many times before, but he's quite new to the Bristol Bulldogs, top-of-the-range fighter that have just come into service.
Christ, what are you doing?
Doing this precision, very close-quarter flying is really, really hard.
Typically pushing himself to the limit, he flew too low, too fast.
And you only need to misjudge something at that level by a foot or two at that speed, 100 miles an hour, in a biplane, wing touches the ground. You total it, and it's just as simple as that. He admits himself, I just made a mistake.
They thought he was actually dying. He heard 2 nurses talking, and one said to the other, "Shush, there's a boy dying in there."
Battling to save their young patient stricken with gangrene, doctors had already removed his shattered right leg when they were forced to amputate the left leg as well.
Of course, it was terrible. Can you imagine, the age of 21, losing both your legs?
This is where they'll make you better.
Defying doctors' predictions, he would learn to walk unaided on artificial legs and was determined to fly again.
His doctor says to him, look, you've got to face facts. You're never going to walk again without a stick.
No! No, I've got to do it. You can take this blasted thing with you.
And he thinks, right, I'm absolutely never, ever going to use a stick. And he never does. Ever.
He accepts that the accident was his fault and attempts to lead as normal life as possible. But remember, this is the 1930s, and he'd be regarded as a cripple, and those people were not expected to lead a normal life. But Barda doesn't give up.
Resuming normal life also meant going out with girls like local waitress Thelma Lucas.
Thelma always thought that he would be somebody special, because, of course, my mother wasn't at all happy about this engagement. You know, a man with no job, no money and no legs was not exactly the person you'd choose for your beautiful daughter to marry, was it?
The couple married, but Douglas Bader was not the type to settle in an ordinary job.
He has 6 very long, miserable years in the 1930s where he becomes a clerk with a shell company who actually look after him very well, it has to be said, just itching for his chance to fly again.
At that time, people branded as cripples were not expected to drive, let alone fly. But Bader remastered both with aplomb.
He then goes up into the air, and having not flown for God knows how many years, having not flown a 400 horsepower single-seater monoplane aircraft before, and it's just, you know, the years melt away. And he's a complete natural. It absolutely comes straight back to him, and he flies it around the air absolutely beautifully.
When Hitler marched into Poland, the former boxer was ready for the next fight.
He was excited. He kept rushing about saying, they'll have to have me now. And he said, you know, you're terribly short of pilots, and you know that I'm an experienced pilot. And I suggest you let me join up immediately. And after a pause, they said yes. It was like a life sentence prisoner suddenly being told he was free.
I was 19 when he came back, and he was, what, 29, 30 or thereabout. So he came back with quite a reputation of being a rather difficult man, in the nicest possible way.
Pilot Tom Neal joined the RAF Reserve in 1938. He was typical of the youth and inexperience lined up to face the Luftwaffe.
You were taken out to the aeroplane and said, all right, well, now fly it. And suddenly you were faced with an aircraft which had a 1,030 horsepower engine, who went at 450 miles an hour.
Douglas Bader had his first taste of action on the 1st of June, 1940. The RAF was scrambled to provide air cover for one of the greatest escapes in history, as the shattered, surrounded remnants of the British Army were rescued from Dunkirk.
Bader's first combat, he actually had a massive stroke of luck because he comes up against a young, inexperienced German pilot, and Bader just swings in behind him at about 3,000 feet, expecting this guy to suddenly duck out of the way, dive out of the way, take evasive action. And he doesn't, he just stays there. So Bader goes right up his backside, opens fire with his 8 Browning, and the guy just goes straight down into the sea.
After the Messerschmitt 109 fighter, he also shot down a Heinkel 111 bomber.
In many ways, he has a further advantage by having no legs, and that is the tighter the turn you do, it causes negative gravity, which then causes the blood to drain from your head down to your toes, and then you actually black out. But because Bader doesn't have any legs for the blood to flow to, his blackout point is much less than your ordinary pilot.
In Britain's darkest hours, a man used to battling adversity would shine.
We'd been knocked out. No army, navy somewhere up in Scotland, and only fighter command, basically, to keep the Germans at bay.
Barder was a born leader, and at 30, much older than the raw recruits joining the RAF.
He quickly becomes a section leader, then he becomes a flight lieutenant, and he's an obvious choice, post-Dunkirk, to become a squadron leader. Absolutely obvious choice. I mean, it's blindingly clear that this is where he needs to be.
He was made commanding officer of 242 Hurricane Squadron at Duxford, near Cambridge. It was another mountain to climb.
242 Squadron, like many of the squadrons that have been in action over Dunkirk and over France in the dark days of May and early June, you've got to remember that a lot of these pilots have been together for a long time, so they're a very close-knit bunch, and suddenly a third of them have gone. So morale is low.
Expectations were also at rock bottom. The pilots were Canadians, sometimes regarded as second-rate, undisciplined, and unreliable.
242 Squadron was a Canadian squadron, and he walked in to meet them, and they said, that's all we need now. We've got a man with no legs.
Many of his pilots were young, inexperienced, and worn out. But they were in the last line of defense against Hitler's legions, ready to invade after the Luftwaffe bombed Britain into submission. Barder would knock them into shape.
Gentlemen, I'm your new squadron leader. On your feet, please. Let's get this girl flying.
He led by example.
His natural flying ability, he shows that the legs don't matter at all. His force of character, he doesn't make a fuss about it, he doesn't use a stick. The fact that he's so obviously competent and brilliant in the air, the disability just melts away.
Barder seized this moment to go out, get into an aircraft, and show by demonstrating how he handled that aircraft and busted up the airfield. The Canadians at that point knew they had a leader they could respect.
He'd proven himself, but his young, inexperienced pilots faced the fight of their lives against an enemy determined to wipe them out. In July 1940, Britain was on its knees. Outnumbered, exhausted, and demoralized, a group of Canadian pilots fighting for the RAF were about to be whipped into shape by their new commander. Douglas Barder quickly gained their loyalty and respect.
Come on, boys, get in. Get in here.
They were wearing sweaters and sort of some old pair of trousers, and Douglas was horrified. Canadians are not servile, and they felt they'd been very poorly treated one way and another. He was exactly the right person. They adored him.
As well as new uniforms, they desperately needed spare parts for their Hurricane fighters.
Secretary's fine. Yes, put me straight through to Sir Hugh.
Alan Smith flew with Douglas Barder and knew him well.
He would say to any high-ranking officer, look, I'm not sending my men out unless you do something about whatever the problem was.
Yes, Barder here, with 242. I want a meeting regarding...
He would care of his men and his ground personnel. The ground people thought he was great.
Planes, non-operational. Missing vital parts. Get all of that?
Douglas simply got onto the Air Ministry and made such a fuss. I can imagine them saying, oh, for heaven's sake, let's shut him up, send the spare.
The man who had overcome the loss of 2 legs to fly and fight was an inspiration to the pilots he took under his wing.
That's it, old boy, out of the sun. Now come in and settle in next to me.
Good move, old man.
And what Barder can do is he can use all his experience as an early 1930s pilot and then as his time with 19th Squadron at the beginning of the war and teach these guys some tricks and get them in the air, get them dogfighting.
Thank you, sir.
Barder has the three mantra that he religiously believes in. Get as close as you possibly can. None of this 400 yards nonsense. Get in at least 250 yards, if not 150. Always have the sun behind you wherever you possibly can. And always have the height advantage.
Beware of the Hun in the sun, because if you're looking in sun, you can't see anything. Christ, I'm in the wrong place in the wrong time.
Hitler planned to invade Britain. Luftwaffe chief Hermann Goering assured his Führer that German planes would annihilate the RAF in just 4 days.
German plan for invasion of England. Phase 1. Knock out the Royal Air Force and its bases. Get control of the air and the sea lanes across the channel. Destroy communication and transport lines. Above all, get command of the air.
Doing a cross-channel invasion is no easy matter, and Hitler doesn't really know what to do. And in actual fact, throughout June, he first of all finishes off France, and then into July is pondering what his next move is. He's hoping that Britain is just going to sue for peace. But Britain, with Churchill at the helm, has no intention of doing that.
Outnumbered and outgunned, the RAF waited for the Nazi onslaught.
What you have is long days of boredom, where you're kicking around the dispersal hut. You have to be there because you might be called out at any minute. But there's not a lot to do. And if you're a man of action like Barder, you're not someone who can just sit there and plough through War and Peace. You're restless, you're pacing up and down, you're playing cards, you're thinking more tactics. Perhaps you might even be thinking too much.
The dreaded attack that everyone knew would come was launched on a Black Friday, the 13th of August, 1940. To Douglas Bader's frustration, his pilots were not among those stationed on the front line. 242 Squadron was initially based at RAF Coltishall, 100 miles northeast of London.
Get us in the bloody air, Woody. We need to be there. We're ready.
Of course, one of the reasons why Barder isn't posted to 11 Group is because he can't scramble into the air in 3 minutes. He's pretty good on his pegs, but he can't run to his Hurricane.
The alarm would sound, you'd have to drop everything and run.
Tom Neal's memories of life as a 20-year-old Spitfire pilot remain vivid.
The rules said that you had to be airborne within 3 minutes. And a lot of people did their fighting in their pajamas. And it was an embarrassing moment where they'd be shot down, force landed, and they'd have the pajamas.
The Luftwaffe pounded RAF air defenses in the southeast. The odds were staggering. German planes outnumbered the British 3-1.
"242 Squadron Scramble, Angels 15 North Wheel."
242, scramble!
Douglas Bader's moment came as the Luftwaffe prowled further across Britain. 242 Squadron was scrambled to defend an airfield at North Weald, 30 miles north of London. The enemy force awaiting them was vast. 100 Junkers 88 bombers flanked by Messerschmitt 109 fighters, flying in with the sun behind them.
As fighter pilots, we often had to escort bombers on missions.
Luftwaffe ace Hans Eckerhard Bob flew the feared Me 109 fighter during the Battle of Britain.
So imagine, one layer of clouds beneath us and one layer above. All of a sudden, English fighters came upon our formation directly from behind us and began their attack. That was such a shocking experience for us. and made us realize that something technical had to have made that possible.
Da muss doch irgendwas
Something we didn't know anything about yet.
von dem wir noch gar keine Ahnung hatten.
That secret weapon gave the outnumbered RAF a fighting chance. It was the world's first early warning radar system. The Germans underestimated the importance of radar in the epic fight that became known as the Battle of Britain. It saved the Royal Air Force in those first critical weeks.
Gentlemen?
It meant that precious planes like Douglas Bader's Hurricanes could be deployed with precision. His squadron was instructed to meet the phalanx of German raiders at 18,000 feet.
Vector 270, Angels 18.
They were flying into one of the most desperate dogfights of the war.
Enemy aircraft, 10 o'clock, level.
They were 9 fighters taking on a force of more than 100 German aircraft. Their Hawker Hurricanes were also obsolete compared to the latest Messerschmitt 109s. The ME 109s were made of steel. The Hurricane was a biplane converted into a single-wing fighter, its part timber frame wrapped in canvas.
And while the British fighters were only equipped with machine guns, we already carried small cannons. This means that if you were able to take aim, the German weapons had the advantage that a fired shot was deadly most of the time.
But the Hurricane had one crucial advantage over the ME 109. Tony Pickering was just 19 when he flew with Douglas Bader.
It could outdive a Hurricane, and it could outclimb a Hurricane, but we could turn inside them.
Und die Engländer haben in engen Kurven.
And the English would try to gain the advantage in a dogfight by flying tight corners.
Gestalten.
Douglas Bader trained his pilots to make the most of any advantage.
Level flight, it would be, I would say, 30, 40 miles an hour faster than we were. But if he came behind us, all we need to do was do a quick turn around. He couldn't keep with us then. He couldn't turn inside us. And you could bring a Hurricane round, probably a little bit more clumsily, but it would come round and be on the tail of the Messerschmitt 109 before we knew what to do.
They also followed their leader's mantra. Climbing thousands of feet above the enemy, using the sun as a blinding shield behind them. And getting in as close as possible at the heavier bombers, taking them out before the German fighters caught up.
Our tactics were to get slightly above them, come down on them at full throttle, with 3 of us in line abreast and another 3 probably 50 yards away in line abreast, and go straight into the bombers. You should have fired actually from about 300 yards. I don't doubt we were firing at 400 yards, and by the time we got to within about 100 yards of the bombers, down we went underneath them, before the 109s could pick us off.
Bloody bastards! This is our bloody sky!
At the end of a remarkable day, Douglas Bader and the 8 pilots under his charge claimed 12 kills with no losses. In just 2 weeks, he had transformed a demoralized mob into a lethal fighting force.
He was supposed to be guarding the airfield, and he'd gone off after these German bombers that he'd seen and shot down a lot. And when he got back, Lee Mallory rang him and said, "What have you been up to?" Keith Park's been on the phone saying you've been poaching on his territory. I mean, you couldn't believe it, could you? Well, says Douglas, we shot down 15 or something, you know.
An heroic few. The outnumbered and exhausted pilots and ground crews of the RAF had defied the odds and the might of Hitler's Luftwaffe. In its first day of action, Douglas Bader's squadron of 9 men scored a dozen confirmed kills. Their new CO had transformed the Canadian volunteers into an elite fighting force. But Douglas Bader had bigger ambitions and championed a new tactic to thwart the waves of Nazi raiders.
At the beginning of the Battle of Britain, it was usual for RAF squadrons to attack German bomber formations singly. It was Bader's idea to attack with multiple formations.
Douglas's idea was that he would take a larger group of aircraft and get into the Huns, you know, a little bit later than we did.
We've done a bloody good job here, boys. Bloody good job.
It's time we were on the offense.
We get more than...
The so-called Big Wing flew in the face of accepted tactics of short, sharp guerrilla attacks. The former boxer wanted to deliver knockout blows, with hundreds of fighters meeting the Hun head-on.
He starts to convince himself that actually what is required is attacks by massed formations of fighters, not willy-nilly little bits of squadrons pecking at the Luftwaffe as they come over. Far better to have a mass of 3 to 5 squadrons together, some 50 aircraft in the air at one time, attacking a big formation.
The Big Wing idea also ensured that smaller squadrons like his, stationed well outside London, would still be in the thick of it.
A threat. It'll be a moment where we stop them.
Bader's philosophy was, me first, I'm next, anything left I'll have. And that equated to being around in big formations. You know, it's all part of him. And he was a gallant man in many ways, and you need them in wartime, but not too many of them. And he was one of those chaps.
Keen, as always, to tackle adversity with a fight, Douglas Bader enthusiastically led his squadron in several big-wing counterattacks. But even now, debate continues over whether it was the right thing to do.
On the 15th of September 1940, there were 2,000 aircraft in the sky at once. And we would be coming back to North Weald, you know, our tongues hanging out, lost half your people. And there would the Duxford wing, 60 strong, saying, my goodness, where are the enemy now? The enemy had long since gone home. We knew as a fighting people further south that flexibility in battle was the best thing, and we should have been flexible and not going around in huge formations.
Tactically, Big Wing is not doing what Bader and Lee-Mallory are saying it is. Its value is in the psychological damage it causes to the Germans, which is not what Bader wants. You know, that's not what he's claiming for it. But it does have its value.
Did it work? Some people said it took too long to form up to be effective. But it has to be said that later in the war, the Big Wing strategy was copied by the Germans.
Whatever the size of its formations, the RAF gained the upper hand, especially when Hitler redirected his bombers to concentrate on destroying London instead of the vital airfields. The Germans suffered double the number of downed aircraft, and by October 1940 had lost the Battle of Britain. It was Hitler's first significant defeat, a crushing blow to the Führer's plans to take Britain out of the war. A brave few, like Douglas Bader and his fellow pilot Tom Neal, saved Britain from Nazi invasion.
During the 16 weeks of the Battle of Britain, I flew 141 times, which is a lot of times, sometimes five times a day. I flew more intensively than almost anybody person during the Battle of Britain. The average number of flights flown was about 50. Some of them were shot down the first go. Some of them lasted something longer than that, but it was very rare that everybody got to 140. I put this down to the fact that I was very good at ducking and weaving.
The ducking and weaving continued for Douglas Bader. Promoted to wing commander and based on the south coast, the man with the tin legs got what he wanted. a frontline posting, and a state-of-the-art supermarine Spitfire. As usual, he made an impressive entrance.
This single Spitfire came across the sky, and he did 2 slow rolls, 1 flip roll, and then side slip to lose height. He was such a magnificent pilot. There's no way you can explain it, why a particular person can make a particular piece of machinery do things that nobody else can.
And I said to the chap at the guard room, "Who's that?" And he said, "That's Mr. Barder." And I said, "I couldn't do that with the legs that God gave me, and he could do it with tin legs."
And then Douglas would put it down as gentle as a daisy. Whereas most of us went crash. He taxied in, switched off, and the little side panel for getting out, and did the side panel, and out came the leg. And he just said, "Who are you?" "Smith, sir. Sergeant Smith, sir." He said, "You'll do." He chose me to fly with him. And, you know, like Jesus saying, "Come now."
Right then, gentlemen, what we're looking at here is fairly straightforward, so pay attention. What we're planning on doing is sending 2 sweeper missions to here and here.
Wing Commander Douglas Bader was in charge of his own big wing. With the Battle of Britain won, the RAF was on the offensive.
Thinking that I've been his wife all his life instead of that bastard Hitler.
Douglas Bader was leading search and destroy raids over enemy territory.
He can do what they do, but even better.
And what they decided is that actually what they're going to do is big fighter sweeps over the Channel and back into northern France and try and destroy the Luftwaffe on the ground, which is exactly, of course, what the Luftwaffe are trying to do in 1940 and at which they fail at. These are called rhubarbs, these big fighter sweeps, where you would have masses of multiple squadrons, certainly wings of 3 squadrons, and sometimes you would have as many as 6 squadrons in the air at one time, 50 to 100 fighters. And they do shoot down a lot of enemy aircraft, there's no question about it. But they also lose a lot in the process because they're suffering from exactly the same disadvantages now that the Luftwaffe was suffering in 1940, i.e. if you get shot down over England and you're a British pilot in 1940, you can be up in the air again by that afternoon. If you get shot down as a British pilot over France, you're not going to be flying again that afternoon because you're going to be a prisoner of war and that's you out for the rest of the war. So there is real mixed views about the use of these rhubarbs and the value of them. But for someone like Bader, who is very keen to be in the thrust of action and be absolutely in the front line, he's all for it. And you're not having to scramble in 3 minutes because you're not reacting to something anymore. You are deciding where you are going to do your fighter sweeps. So typically you would have a briefing the night before and you would know that at 10 o'clock that following morning, weather permitting, you were going to be taking off on a rhubarb over northern France or wherever it might be.
Long after he'd lost his legs in the accident caused by reckless aerobatics, Douglas Bader retained a daredevil streak that also put others in danger.
I flew with him very often, but he very often put us in danger's way. Our first invasion of airspace in France, he led us as a formation, and we were supposed to go across at 7,000 feet. We suddenly found ourselves going across at 5,000 feet, at 2,000 feet, and at 800 feet, and being shot at like mad from the ground, all because of Douglas Bader. And we lost 1 or 2 people on that particular do, because he didn't obey the rules, and this was typically Douglas Bader. He was a mind unto himself, because he was just Douglas Bader. He just wanted to do it his way, and of course you all had to follow, but hey-ho.
Someone can call themselves a fighter race if they've scored 5 confirmed aerial victories. Now, Bader does achieve that in the Battle of Britain, but most of his successes, his fighter successes, come in 1941 when he's leading his wing over to France on those rhubards, those sweeps over France. That's where his score escalates.
How you're written about, you become a hero because people write about you. But I'm never mentioned at all. I fought like mad, nobody ever mentioned me until after the war.
Douglas Bader flew into battle leading from the front. To the right and slightly behind him, wingman Alan Smith was watching his back.
In the middle of a battle over France, which were frequent and several times a day, you had what was called a beehive, which was the Messerschmitts and Spitfires and Hurricanes, all literally a beehive. It's a good word to describe it. You were sweating because there was bullets flying around and parachutes in occasion. And then suddenly this calm voice over the air says,
Yes, I quite forgot to book the squash court for 7 o'clock this evening. Would you mind doing it for me? Bit indisposed at the moment, old chap.
for Christ's sake, if all he's worrying about, why are we worrying about all these bloody Germans that are all over the place? You immediately felt calm. To hell with the Germans, we play squash at 7 o'clock tonight.
No.
Bader was relentless, working himself and his pilots into the ground. In one frenzied 8-day spell, he claimed 12 kills. But the strain of battle took its toll.
He had to take painkillers all the time. But you see, that was just part of it. He never admitted that anything was wrong in any way. When he was walking and all his weight was on these tin legs, it was painful and restricting. But when he was sitting in the cockpit, he could do that without any difficulty at all. And all he was thinking about was getting back to it somehow.
Hello there, boys.
The wing commander was wearing himself out.
There is also a feeling that Bader is also coming near the end of his operational use. There is a point where you've just been doing it for too long. Most people didn't do more than 6 months. Bader had done 18 months and more. The plan is to wait till the autumn, wait till sort of September, something like that, and then he'll go and do a different job, instructing or whatever it might be, and have a break from operational flying. But he doesn't, and he doesn't take the chance to step down when he could have done.
Well, I thought you would like to know, sir. The cannon on the Spits are getting rusty, and the boys are fed up.
He was careful not to show the stress and strain.
Well, more fighter sweep, sir, is what we want. Thank you, sir. Good night. To get some sleep.
Douglas was never reckless, and he would never put me or a wingman or anybody else in danger. Douglas always took it on the chin as well. He never passed the buck. And that's why he was not too popular with various senior officers who had an inflated opinion of themselves.
Ignoring the fatigue that was gripping him, Douglas Bader led another flight of Spitfires to occupied France on the 9th of August, 1941.
Control, come in, this is Bader.
His airspeed indicator and radio failed.
Beetle, this is Bader. Come in.
The celebrated ace could not hear the urgent warning from ground control.
Dog's body from Beetle. There are 20 plus 5 miles to the east of you.
They'd spotted 12 Messerschmitt 109s on radar. Douglas Bader was flying into a trap. It was the legendary Douglas Bader's final dogfight.
Lost.
Unaware that he was flying into a superior force of 12 German fighters, he still managed to shoot down 2 Messerschmitt 109s. But two more were swiftly on his tail, closing in for the kill.
When I came back, yes, you know, everybody's face. Douglas hasn't come back.
And he just came in through the door and said, "Thelma, I'm sorry to tell you Douglas didn't come back today." Oh, the shock of it was simply awful. I mean, one was absolutely sort of frozen with horror.
This kind of thing couldn't happen to a man like Barder. But of course it can happen to anybody.
And of course, they couldn't tell us then whether he was dead or alive.
Almost physical feeling of sadness and sort of, this can't happen, it can't happen.
After 5 days, the Germans put out on the radio that they'd got him, so then we had a big celebration.
Barder was locked inside a German prison hospital. One of his false legs went down with his Spitfire. He demanded a replacement.
In
Germany, we didn't really have any facilities to manufacture wooden legs.
In an extraordinary accord, Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Goering agreed to allow the RAF to drop him a new leg.
So it was agreed, at a specific time and at a specific airfield, an English plane would fly over and throw down the wooden leg for Barder.
And it was just a package, a parachute floating down with a brown paper parcel swinging on it. That was Douglas's legs.
But the Germans underestimated the wing commander's tenacity.
I think it was the second following night. Who was climbing out of the hospital window upstairs? Douglas. That's the type of man I'm talking about.
It was the first of many attempted escapes. The exasperated Germans threatened to confiscate his false legs. He was finally thrown into the notorious prison at Coldis, where he stayed until the end of the war. He returned to Britain and his wife Thelma in 1945.
He was never spoilt by all that fame. That was the extraordinary thing.
Some historians disagree, accusing him of exaggerating and embellishing his achievements. But there's no doubting the skill and determination of the man who embodied the bulldog spirit that saved Britain in its darkest hour.
He epitomized the Battle of Britain just as much as Churchill did.
He was the first person ever to lead a more or less normal life, so badly disabled as that. That's what was so marvelous about him. He was an inspiration to the world, really.
The Battle of Britain was not won by the Royal Air Force. It was won by everyone in this country, by the people on the ground who took the bombing, the fire services and all these auxiliary services who fought the flames, who didn't give up. I mean, anybody can, it's much easier, put it that way, it's much easier to go into the battle and fight than it is to sit on the ground and take it and watch you and me doing the fighting, you see what I mean? Yeah. So don't make any mistake, this Battle of Britain is the lot of us, it's not just the Royal Air Force.
War History Night returns next Tuesday from 8. After the break, Nazi Secrets reveals the double life of mass murderer and SS chief Heinrich Himmler.